I'm Dominica DeGrandis, and I work for this awesome company called Tasktop, but more on what I do later. Let's just jump into it. Let's talk calendars. When I ask people to write down what prevents them from getting their work done, what's the team pain, this is the list that I usually get. Lots of interruptions, everything's a bloody priority one. There's no time to fix tech debt or do any kind of internal improvements. Or we have a million tools, none of them are integrated. And here comes another reorg with yet another process improvement. And then too many meetings. Like if we didn't have to attend so many meetings, we could get some real work done. And enough people have told me this that it inspired this talk, which is going to cover two things. One is I want to take on the too many meetings in the calendar and talk about ways to manage your calendar, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road. We talk about pull systems, we talk about limiting WIP in our Kanban boards, we try and limit our WIP, but then the invites come on the calendar, and when we say yes, when we've got too much of that going on, we've effectively turned our system into a push system, even though we're calling it a pull system. And there's a number of good reasons why we say yes, but that's another talk. So the first thing is I want to show a new way to manage a calendar that's been working pretty good for me, and two, how to get buy-in from the boss to experiment with this approach. Because calendars that are just chock full of meetings leave sparse time to do cool things and provide business value. They only have so much room in the calendar. I think the original intent was just to have one thing fill a block of time in the calendar, yet they get double booked, they get triple booked, and in the case of Paula Thresher, they get quintuplet booked. So let's look at some common calendar types. For people who complain about their calendars, I've seen a pattern with these three kinds. I call this the 30-minute jam, the all-day cram, and the triple booked wham. Looking at the 30-minute jam, this is where your day is broken up to 8 to 10 30-minute meetings. They're all back-to-back. So show of hands, how many of you are sporting the 30-minute jam? Wow. 60, 70%. Keep your hands up if you're a people manager. Okay, yeah, about 50%, which doesn't surprise me because people managers tend to have lots of one-on-ones and they tend to run back-to-back with each other. The problem with a 30-minute jam is that there's a lot of context switching that occurs. So it's like rush hour traffic. The minute you get up to speed and get in the groove, it's time to end, and you have to change gears and jump into another lane and go again. You lose some momentum. And so next up is the all-day cram. This calendar has no white space. Show of hands, how many of you got this going on? Who's sporting the all-day cram? Got about 10%. So keep your hands up if you're like senior leadership or VP. Okay. The problem with the all-day cram is that there's no room for variability. So if you've got some unplanned work headed your way, production's down, whatever, that means you got to cancel a meeting. And then people get disappointed. If it's a real meeting where you're getting feedback and making decisions, like a real working meeting, not just a status meeting, then the probability of somebody having spent a lot of time to prepare some information to be reviewed and discussed is probably pretty high, and when those meetings get canceled or rescheduled, it's disappointing. Now I got to go off and come back at some other point. And how often meetings are canceled is an interesting data point. Right? How much time do we waste rescheduling meetings? And how much more could we get done if meetings weren't so frequently rescheduled? And this is happening with the triple book calendar. So, we cannot be in 3 places at one time. What happens? You either cancel, You do one of those, carry on without me, right? Or you reschedule it. But either way, there's a cost in that rework, because if the people who don't show up, like, where's Sarah? You go to a meeting, you expect all these people to be there, and then Sarah's not there. Well, where's Sarah? Well, Sarah couldn't make it because she's dealing with that security issue. So, we invited John, but John doesn't have that information on the app. And then, Chris can't make it either. So now we got to reschedule, and we got to start all over again. When the right brains aren't at the meeting to make the decision, then that decision gets delayed. And so the idea to think about, I think, is what is the cost of the delay of that decision or that feedback to the organization as a whole? Here's the thing. People move on. The meeting gets rescheduled. Whoever created that material to review, they're going to move on. They're going to do other things. And it's complicated work that we do. So to drop what we're doing, context switch, move on, and then come back later, it's challenging to wrap our heads around what we were talking about, because we work in the complex space. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of uncertainty. Our knowledge work is perishable. And the more time that goes between doing the work and then getting feedback or decisions on that work, the more likely that people are going to forget about it. And then you got to go research and get the data again and rehash the decision and get back up to speed. So show of hands, who's got this going on? Okay, we've got about 25% of the room. And keep your hands up if you're a specialist or a practitioner. Just maybe like less than 10%. So what to do about this? Here's a new approach to think about. Maybe some of you have already seen this. I see Randy shaking his head there. So Paul Graham, founder of Y Combinator, they fund early stage startups. He introduced this idea of two kinds of schedules. There's a manager schedule and a maker schedule. And the manager's schedule is for decision makers, usually the senior leadership. And their calendar is parsed into 1 hour segments throughout the day, and that's when they meet with other decision makers. The maker schedule is for creative people, so developers, designers, writers, and they prefer large chunks of time because it's hard to write or design anything really well in just an hour. Sometimes that's barely enough to get started. And it's one reason why creative maker people dislike meetings so much, because they're on a different schedule. Maker people are on a different schedule. And so each type of schedule basically serves its purpose, except for when the two collide. And meetings tend to cost creative maker people a lot more because of the interruptions to the intense focus that's needed to do this complicated work. Interruptions are not good for being in the zone, right? The zone, that place where we're intensely focused, we kind of lose sense of time and space, and we're able to get some of the best work that we do done. We get cranky when people interfere with our being in the zone, as my husband can attest to. I'm in the zone. You can tell just by looking on somebody's face. I feel like if you really want to piss somebody off, go find somebody who's in the zone and then just tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, you got a minute? And that ought to do it, because that's enough to interrupt their train of thought. And sometimes it can take up to 20 minutes to get back to where we were before we got interrupted. So what might an ideal creative maker calendar look like? Something with large chunks of time that allows people to focus without interruption. I call this D1 or D2 if it's in the afternoon. What's a D1? A D1 is a large chunk of time where I can get my delivery one done for the day. This is the most important thing that I need to finish, or at least get to a good stopping place. And I want a full 90 minutes to 2 hours, large chunk of time. Because if I can get something done before noon, before lunch, I feel good, I'm happy, I feel accomplished, I'm motivated, I like my job. There's lots of benefits when creative maker people are allowed to have uninterrupted time. And if you can get 2 in a day, all the better. Why 2 hours? Because the ultradian cycles, our brains can focus really well for 90 to 120 minutes until the human brain needs a bit of a rest. It's also why back-to-back meetings all day are a challenge, because our brain doesn't get the rest it needs to come back strong. So my question is, when do creative maker people get a calendar like this? Anybody in the room have a calendar like this? Well, so they don't when other meetings are scheduled haphazardly throughout the day. Right? And if we can't get to this work during the day, when does it happen? It happens at midnight or Sunday afternoon, when you know you're not going to be interrupted. And if we're working at midnight or 2 a.m., I'll just put my quote here: quality doesn't happen on 4 hours of sleep. And I'd like to suggest that we could find a way to help creative maker people be able to do their best work during the day. Unless, of course, they choose to work at night. I mean, it is, but if we took a poll of how many people would enjoy having large chunks of uninterrupted time during their actual working day, I suspect it could be pretty high. So one way for managers to give creative maker people time to meet with other one way for managers to help creative maker people is to schedule their meetings, their manager meetings with other decision makers during prime creative maker time. So if leadership, and you've got all your meetings with other decision makers kind of grouped. In this example, those would be in the morning, so that on the maker calendar, their mornings would be free of meetings. And management's in a position to make everybody meet at their frequency. Right? But I think the smarter ones refrain from doing that, because they know that if they can help the people, the creative maker people doing the work, if they can give them larger chunks of time, then they can improve their quality and their throughput and help them arrange their calendar. So what about all hands and ops reviews? I worked for an organization. We had to stand up every morning, 9:30 to 9:45. And this spontaneous, completely unintentional thing started happening called the after stand-up. Because we got done at 9:45, everybody had 15 minutes before they had to get to their next meeting. And in those 15 minutes, what I observed was people, they knew they could come find me. I'd be at the after stand-up, and it reduced the drive-bys past my office. Additionally, because people had just been talking about issues and blockers and what was preventing them from getting work done, they were able to have extra time to find solutions. So instead of having to create a meeting on Thursday, next week Thursday, because it's the only time you could get the architects all together in a room, we could often solve some problems right after a short meeting. So having some unstructured time after a department meeting, like all hands or ops review, has been very effective in my opinion. And it can help. It can be like one little slice of reducing interruptions, because you're there, you're in the room, and people will hopefully won't have to come knock on your door then. What's up for debate is what time of the day should the creative maker people get? And that's contextual, depends on your organization. Are you remote? Is everybody on site? 1 p.m. in Chicago is 11 a.m. in Seattle. And so it's a decision that I encourage you to visit. When can we give these people some uninterrupted time? So what if the manager is also a creative maker? Like, when do they get uninterrupted time? And one way to do that is through office hours in orange here, and what I call do not disturb hours, D and D. So let's look at office hours first. Office hours is when you allow people to schedule time with you, your team members or people whose time you value. And Paul Graham used it to advise many, many people, many startups. So several times a week, he set aside office hours in the afternoon to meet with founders. And he intentionally did it at the end of the day because meetings at that time or the end of the working day tended to reduce them going very long because people got to get on, pick up kids, get home, have dinner and whatnot. So it's a way to reserve time for important meetings, right? The goal for undoing the all-day cram begins essentially with you have to actually allocate time to do your most important work. You have to reserve that space. Do not disturb hours. I first saw this in LA. I was working with the IT ops team, and down the hall was service desk and help desk. And every day at noon or even earlier, they would close their door and they would put up this little plastic clock with a time on it, and they would say basically, do not disturb, come back at 1 o'clock. Every day, same place, same cadence. And what they did basically was train everybody else not to bother them before 1 o'clock. If production's down, come knock on our door. Otherwise, wait until 1. And it mostly worked. So it reduced interruptions. I've seen other, so when people might say, but I don't have a door. I can't just close my door. And in that case, trying to find some way to have a visual cue near your desk, or some people put headphones on. The only problem with headphones is help people know when they can get your time. Like if you just have your headphones on 24/7, that's probably not going to work either. Personally, my D&D hours are 6 to 8 a.m. It's the most important part of my day. It's when I write. It's when I do yoga. And it may seem too early, but it's when I say no to people who want to schedule meetings with me. I'm in Seattle, so 7 a.m. Seattle is 10 a.m. New York time, or 3 p.m. in Europe. That may not be an unreasonable time for them. But by saying no, I give myself permission to take care of my health and to crank out the most important things I need to get done that day. If you're going to get the work of your life done, you need to ferociously protect your time to make that happen, to do what matters most. If your current strategy is I'll sleep when I'm dead, then as a human, consider what that's going to do to your long-term health and well-being. So let's look at a combo calendar. Actually, it's kind of a real calendar. There's a little bit of everything going on. This is the before view. There's some 30-minute jam. There's some maker stuff in here, and there's a triple booked spot in the pink and the green. So this is the problem. When meetings are just kind of distributed across the day and you only have an hour here and a half an hour here, it's not enough time to get any real work done for most people. It's just there's no time to go deep. You got to move on. But if you can make a couple slight adjustments, you could get this. This is the same calendar, same meetings, but they're rearranged to try and squeeze in some D1 time and some do not disturb hours. And yeah, these are in the afternoon, but with your department and talking about it with your leadership, maybe you could swap that out to the morning. The triple book meetings did force a prioritization. Like we did have to schedule those other 2 meetings. But better to reschedule them up front than wait to the meeting and then not show. So you'll notice a time slot here called Pomodoro time. Let's look at that. Pomodoro is a type of tomato sauce, but it's also an interruption buster. And it's probably my favorite one. I use a kitchen timer. I set it for 30 minutes, and I put it right down by my laptop, and I intensely focus on my D1. There is something about the of that timer that just does it for my brain. I don't know that I understand it, but I'm able, if I don't have the timer there, it's different. There's something about that time pressure. And I use this method to finish my book. I found it to be very effective for me. So, how do you think people react when I suggest rearranging the calendar and trying some of these interruption busters? Impossible, exactly. We are a heavy meeting culture. Meetings are what we do. We deliver business value because we have so many meetings. There's no way you're going to get 1,000 developers to change the way they're working. Like, we just can't say no. We've got way too much conflicting priorities and unplanned work and too much WIP. And yes, indeed, too much WIP and unplanned work are two of the biggest time thieves around. We did this poll on Twitter asking that question, what prevents you from getting your most important work done? And 40% responded with too much work in progress. A runner-up was unplanned work at 31%. So between the two of those, and conflicting priorities, there's actually 5 thieves of time. The 5th thief is called thief neglected work, but Twitter only allows 4 answers on the poll, and so that thief got neglected. So when I'm talking about with too much work in progress is all the work we started but haven't finished yet. So it's the partially completed work that we're trying to juggle. And people often recognize it when they are supporting multiple teams at the same time. And so they end up having too much work in progress because Team A's priority isn't Team B's priority. And the result is that they end up becoming a bottleneck to everybody else's project. They get allocated over 100%. We don't let our servers get to 100% capacity utilization, and we should stop doing that to ourselves and our teams. Unplanned work, real quick. Unplanned work starts with the I can't, right? I can't log into the test environment, can't find the NFS mounts, can't get the build to compile. And unplanned work is the foundation of interruptions, and it causes context switching. So unplanned work takes you away from planned work. It cuts into planned work, cuts into generating business value from business requests and also fixing tech debt from revenue protection work. And then conflicting priorities. I hear a lot, everything's a priority 1. It blocks our flow. And there, I just got to say, everything cannot be a top priority. We can have many priorities, but we can only have one top priority. And it's helpful if we're all really clear on that. But if you're in a large organization and each head of department has their top priority 1, that's going to trickle down, especially to practitioners who are supporting multiple teams. So how can we get buy-in to undo the all-day cram? My background, I was a build engineer, spent many years doing merging, source code control, branching strategies, release management, automation of tools and delivery. And the complaint that I would hear was builds take too long. And I started taking it personal after a while because I wanted to say it's not the builds, it's the big ball of mud architecture. It's because we don't have automated testing. Every time we do a build, we have to do a manual smoke test to do credit card authentication. But nobody listened to my ranting. Did not work well for me. So when people would say builds take too long, I started capturing, okay, how long are they really taking? Let's just look at some data here. And I would present that at ops review, and I'd present cumulative flow diagram, throughput, some quality metrics. And what happened just blew me away. I started to get some empathy I got headcount, I got budget, I got understanding, because I was helping people to visualize and see the problem instead of just audibly ranting about it. I think it's powerful to be the voice of reason in the organization, and that's kind of a lot about what I do now, is I help people make their work visible so you can start to see where the constraints are in the system, and then I help organizations design systems to optimize for the whole value stream, not just optimize for small siloed teams. And this is just an example of one of the exercises that I do in my workshops. I call it the balanced flow exercise. It's fairly easy to game a metric. I think we do it all the time. So it's important to measure the impact of the change to one metric over the others. And so by showing them all in one place. So here we've got 4 metrics, one in each category. How fast, this is speed. How productive, right? How good, and how productive. And I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. So, and I'll give you a link to this exercise at the end of the talk. Basically, there's just a chart where you plot the data points, and there's a spreadsheet that has data points for flow time, or your lead time. That for revenue generation work, revenue protection work, and unplanned work. And so the vertical axis is the number of days that it takes to complete work. And the horizontal axis is the date that work got completed. This chart is for a month. It's broken up into 4 weeks. And so the purple dot on there was a revenue generating work item. It was a business request, a feature request. And it took 14 days to do, and it finished on the 18th of the month. And then you go through and you plot all the completion times and dates for this work. So there's 3 kinds of work item types. The legends on the right, revenue generation, revenue protection. Revenue protection, this is keeping the lights on. This is doing your security updates and maintenance work and fixing technical debt. And revenue or generation is the work that business people or customers are asking you to do. And often that's the work that gets prioritized over the revenue protection work. So if you're sporting the all-day Cram calendar and you have 3 emergencies pop up, which would be unplanned work, it will show up on this chart. Unplanned work on this chart are the triangles. So then you can see that the second week of the month, we had all this unplanned work happening, and the revenue generating request that was supposed to be completed that second week got pushed into the 3rd week now. You can start to describe and explain and show people why things took too long, why they didn't get delivered on time. If you don't track unplanned work, then it's invisible. And if you have a lot of it, it's a problem because invisible work is hard to manage. Next up is how productive. This is your throughput. This is an easy calculation. So in green at the top is the number of items that were completed each week. You might call this velocity. In Flow and Kanban, we call this throughput. And I used to work at Linkit, and Linkit's speed chart actually showed throughput like this, and I liked it, so I stole that from them. So on this chart, you can see as the flow time is increasing, throughput is coming down. Right? You can see the impact that one metric is going to have over the other. Another great question is, like, how could we game these metrics? How are we going to game throughput? I think it's always good to be transparent when you're having a conversation on metrics to see, are these metrics going to be harmful with the organization? Are these metrics, have they been useful, but they're expired now, like we don't need to capture this data anymore? What we measure impacts people tremendously because people value how they're being measured. It changes human behavior. So how would we measure quality? And what would be the impact if we're trying to game cycle time, which people do all the time, they'll tell me, I've heard people say, how can your tool exclude weekends from our lead time metrics? Why would you want to do that? Because it's in our merit review. We need to shrink our lead times. And we don't work weekends, like nobody ever works weekends. So we want to exclude that from our metrics. And then what happens? Well, what's the impact there? In this example, here's one way to measure quality. I acknowledge that measuring quality can be a challenge. So this we're looking at change failure rate. And that's up at the very top too. This is a ratio, and it's based off of failure demand. So I added a pink circle in the legend, and we circled the items that were considered failure demand. In other words, when this thing got delivered, there was a problem with it. It didn't meet the criteria. And much of the failure demand comes from unplanned work, or unplanned work comes from failure demand. So all we're doing here is just dividing the number of items that were considered failures divided by the total number of items, and you get the ratio, and we post that up on the top. The hypothesis with this experiment is, if we scheduled more time for D1s, for creative maker people, larger chunks of time, how would it impact our metrics? Would our throughput go up? Would our cycle time go down? And then, if we want to be more predictable, which is one of two complaints I hear mostly from CIOs, things take too long and never know when they're coming. I'd really like to have more predictability. The idea here is to look at probability. Right? What's the probability? We're trying to be approximately right instead of exactly wrong when it comes to due dates. And if we are doing 3, 6, 9-month deliveries and shooting for a single due date, there's a lot of uncertainty with that. So from a probabilistic perspective, we're trying to say, here we're looking at the 90th percentile. So this is saying 9 out of 10 times we can deliver within this time frame. And I filtered this chart. You can filter it on whatever type of work, but I filtered this one on revenue generating work. So it's filtered just on the business requests. And you might say, well, it's really going up. We have this triangular shape going on because the first week, and you will see this when you first start capturing these kinds of metrics, you will see this kind of shape because your first week, you're just delivering things that you started within that week. But as the time goes forward, the things that took longer to do will start to appear. But this data will typically normalize after a good 3 to 6 months. It takes time. But based on this data, you could say with 90% confidence that we can finish these kinds of work items between 8 and 20 days. If listening to Adrian's talk this morning, if you're making airplanes, 90% may not be good enough. If you're making pacemakers, people want 100%. So then you know that you have to bump things up. But I would guess that there's a whole lot of work that your organizations do where 90% is probably okay. I've been at an org where they'd be delighted if we could just hit 70% on easy fixes. This is licensed under Creative Commons, so you're free to use it. I just ask for attribution and share alike, and I'll give you a link to it. This flow chart, I think, can be utilized at an individual level, at a team level, and department-wide. I think it could scale quite nicely. Probably not going to talk about this too much, but this is a lot of what I do. I help people visualize how their work flows across the system. And in this one, I was trying to bring visibility to 3 kinds of work: the revenue generation, the revenue protection, and unplanned work. And you notice that unplanned work, which is in yellow, like it's not in the backlog. Like you don't see it coming. That work is born in doing, and it will show up either when it's done or when it's just being delivered. And it can help people who aren't understanding why your planned work isn't getting done. Because if you look at the done column, almost half of it was unplanned work. And then the money bags there, this is a way to help teams prioritize. The money bags icon that are in the columns under feedback and deliver, those are visuals to help teams understand what is the highest priority right now for that work. And then the up front on the backlog, if you have a zillion things in your backlog, hopefully you can have a bit of a triage and just go for your top 5, which can be very powerful. Or you ask your customers or your upstream folks, pick your top 5. Get everybody in the room from all the different department leads and let them fight it out. Be amazed. We did this at Corbis, and at first it was whoever yelled the loudest, and then it was a bit of democratization. I vote for you this week, you vote for me next week. And then we started to see people take each other out to lunch on the Friday afternoon before the Monday morning meeting, and they would start bringing their business cases for everybody to decide. It took about 6 months, but over time we changed that culture to people thinking, what's the best thing to do for the whole organization? You know, somebody's got to influence the boss, and it might as well be you. And so if we just take Warren's message here to heart and ruthlessly protect your time by saying no, it could be helpful for you. It's been very helpful for me and the teams that I work with. Your calendar will not organize itself. The onus is on you to do so. If you can protect your time from being stolen. So I have some stickers. If you want some stickers or if you want to talk more about this topic, I'd love to talk with you. After this, I'm going to be in the keynote room facilitating one of the round tables, so come visit there and we can talk. And if you want a copy of this deck, all you have to do is send me an email at dominica@sendyourslides.com. Make sure you put flow in the subject, and you'll get an automatic reply with a link to this deck and some other goodies. I've got a 73-page excerpt of my book, Making Work Visible, and a 45-minute excerpt of the audio book, in case you like audio, along with the balanced flow chart exercise, and then a link to a video for what we do at Tasktop, which is integrate data between disparate tools. So I think this video is showing how, if you have a ticket in ServiceNow and you're using Jira and HP ALM, how can that workflow, how can we connect that work so we can see the big picture? And that's it for me. Please remember to rate this session, and thank you for your time.
So do we have any questions?
So I love the charts and everything as far as getting teams to start measuring things. Mm-hmm. And I saw the reference to Troy McGinnis's work, and it's a lot of inspiration there.
Yes.
How do you convince teams to get started? Because I continue to struggle planting the idea of start measuring some things like cycle time and throughput and WIP levels.
Yeah.
Do you do it for them and set up the canvas for them to work from, or do you just continually nudge them to do it?
I try really hard not to be the one that is pushing that decision. Sometimes I'll get called in by senior leadership to do this training, and people bring in their laptops, and some of them just do not want to be there. But when I ask the question, what prevents you from getting work done, and give them permission to rant a little bit, then it starts coming out. And then they're the ones listing all their problems, all the interruptions and the too many meetings and context switching, and that usually is enough. When we're in pain, it provokes change. Sometimes it takes a crisis, though. Yeah.
Anyone else have a question? Aha. Right.
Hi. We have a company culture where we have a number of strategic priorities, and the philosophy at the top is that if the CEO doesn't give us, or if we don't accomplish some things on the list, then or if we accomplish everything on the list, he feels like he hasn't tasked us enough. So we end up with too much whip, where we have lots of in-progress items, and they're all going slower than he wants. How do you make it clear that you really want to shrink the whip and increase throughput, and maintain focus when you have somebody at the top who wants to be making progress in every single item on the list?
Yeah. They're just trying to do, based on their background, they're just trying to do what they think will work. So that, I think, needs some extra visualization to help people see that when you've got, and with the metrics, you got to have the story and then I think the metrics. And they can see the story on the board and then you can speak to it with the data. So there's no one right answer to that, but I've seen organizations, they'll create like a VP horizontal swim lane on their board. They'll call it the VP lane or the CEO lane, and those are for all the requests that are coming in from the CEO. Usually they're unplanned work where they're calling up their favorite developer to do something. But then you can start to see the neglected work because you can only do so much. And if they're working on A and now you got to swap to work on B, A's gonna sit there and get idle. And so we bring visibility to it by saying, show me everything in your system that hasn't been moved in X number of days. Good starting point is 30 days. Some people might need 60, 90, 120 days. And then when there's that visual of this work, this stale work, that's business value that's just sitting in the system, not moving. So that's one way. I think helping them see it, visualize it, see it, and then be able to tell the story and back it up with data can be helpful. Okay. Sir.
So one of my favorite calendar problems is the slew of project managers who think it's okay to ignore your time and put the note that says, sorry.
Yeah, I bet you I know where you're going though. It's the project manager that says, this is the best meeting time that everybody can meet at.
Or please send a delegate if you can't attend, which would mean I'd have to send a maker
Yeah.
and steal part of their time. How long do you give them before you just...
This is a huge issue, and it's being addressed right now with many people in the DevOps movement. There's a book coming out by Mick Kirsten called From Project to Product. So it's a complete shift away from product, which is challenging, especially if they're funded, if the budgets and the accounting system is funded by projects, and you got to build up a team of people for the project and then tear it down afterwards. There's just all kinds of problems with that. And so moving to a model where people are grouped by product and then delivering on that all the way and maintaining it through production is an answer that people are talking a lot about now. And Cornelia Davis is with Pivotal, just IPO'd. She's got a great talk from the 2017 DevOps Enterprise Summit showing how to reorganize teams, trying to move from project to product. And then I think there'll still be jobs for project managers though, but it's a huge issue, kind of combined with how we do accounting now. Almost anybody who's trying to improve flow or do the DevOps runs into their accounting systems.
I think one of my bigger issues is I'm on about 70 teams per release because my teams involve every project, so everyone expects me to be in every weekly status meeting every week. I say no a lot, but it's...
Yeah, it's impossible. You cannot be in that many places at one time. And I think it boils down to conflicting priorities.
Everything's number one.
Everything's a priority one. And this project manager is incentivized for their project, and this project manager is incentivized for that project. So how to go up the food chain to find somebody who understands that and tell your story and show that, use your voice of reason with your story and your metrics to show the impact. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if we can give Dominica a really big hand of applause, a round of applause.